Germany is a leading power of Europe and one of the wealthiest, most industrialized states on the planet. However, it wasn't always this way. From about the 1400s to the 1800s, the central authority of the Holy Roman Empire gradually declined, until by the 1600s it was little more than a defensive pact against outsiders with some diplomatic weight. The reasons for this are long and complicated, but weak emperors, overextension, the rise of Protestantism, and Prussia all gradually chipped at the state, and Austria's ability to command influence. Napoleon would ultimately kill the empire through his own client state, and Francis II dissolved it as a result, leaving it to be replaced by the German Confederation, which Prussia eventually welded into a proper German empire. From there, of course, Germany's power would warp Europe around it and lead to the World Wars, see it divided once again between East and West, and now it is a leading pillar of Europe and European integration. But this all begs the question, what if Germany never united? Since we're talking about the German Empire here, not East and West Germany, we have about two main choices. The Austro-Prussian Brothers' War over Schleswig-Holstein, or the Franco-Prussian War, which spilled out from the fate of the Spanish monarchy, and thus technically makes it a war of Spanish succession. Now, I do not care for military history. Instead, I tend to focus on things like economics and politics surrounding the wars. But, these were both very short wars where economics of scale were limited mostly to mobilization. Prussian domestic reforms were created specifically to mobilize as many men as quickly as possible, and because it had more cohesive rail networks than both France and Austria, this marks perhaps the only time where Germany had better logistics than its enemies. However, I think that France has a better chance than Austria. See, during the lead-up to the Franco-Prussian War, Napoleon III wasn't entirely stupid, and was aware of the growing tensions with Prussia and their expansionism, so he did at least attempt to find allies and increase the size of the army, both of which failed due to internal opposition and poor timing, respectively. So what we'll do is have the French military accept Napoleon's proposed reforms based on the Prussian model. These were opposed by the main brass tacks of the army due to favoring quantity over perceived quality, but if Napoleon III is able to emphasize how much quantity and speed of mobilization mattered in the Brothers' War, I could almost see it happening. The bill was also detested by Republican opposition to Napoleon III, since they kinda blamed the emperor for the problem in the first place, but we'll say the military is able to convince them. This way, France can mobilize much more quickly and cover the front line much more adequately, and can prevent the massacre at Wissembourg. France would also benefit from gaining an ally in Italy or Austria, but Napoleon's guards in Rome made Italy impossible, and Austria was bound by other commitments. So, no friends for France. If France is able to knock out Baden or the other small German states, it's in a better position to actually defeat the German army. Formerly the North German Confederation, but it's Germany. But now we run into a bit of a problem. See, after France got its ass handed back to it on a paper plate, Germany annexed Alsace-Lorraine, placed military restrictions on France, and occupied the north of the country until the new Third Republic paid off the war indemnity of 5 billion francs. And this was just for a 6-month curb stomp. For the record, I never want to hear anyone complain about the Treaty of Versailles ever again, since Germany set the precedent right here. Regardless, the treaty was seen as incredibly harsh by outside powers like Britain and even Austria, who had fought both powers relatively recently. Regardless, with both France and Prussia actually mobilizing large armies, and France not being defeated in 6 months, the war lasts longer. How long the war lasts is kind of up in the air, but we'll say that Prussia refuses to surrender for about a year. Could be 9 months, could be 15, not sure. While this obviously makes the war worse to be in, and that should not be understated, it also works to France's benefit at the treaty. Why? Because now when they demand the Rhine and Bavarian Palatinate, it doesn't look nearly as harsh. While it's still a crippling blow to the German Federation, it will only raise a few eyebrows in London and Moscow and won't be signing up for an intervention by other powers. France would likely also charge some form of war indemnity, but there wouldn't be an occupation of unceded German lands or anything like that, both due to logistics and the sheer amount of land they just took. There would also likely be some clause in the treaty stipulating the South German states are forbidden from uniting with the North German Confederation, and forcing Germany to revoke their guarantees of Belgium and Luxembourg. France wouldn't be able to push into the Low Countries immediately, but it will be a major goal of the empire. Focusing in on the North German Confederation, this would be a humiliation of both the army and of Otto von Bismarck, the minister-president who effectively controlled civilian government. The Prussian army will appear to have a particular kryptonite in the form of House of Bonaparte, since their defeat in the 1870s will be the first since Napoleon I. Now, the top brass of the army can at least be replaced by the men who were successful in the war, but Bismarck is difficult to replace. In addition, King Wilhelm I of Prussia was, similarly to his son and Napoleon himself, a bit too hands-on for a monarch of this era, and was hesitant to accept legal rather than customary restraints on royal power. Thus, Willy probably attempts to appoint a new aristocratic chancellor to the Landtag, or force through new elections, but these would be disliked by the common people. In the 1860s, Bismarck had effectively ousted the Landtag and Prussian parliamentarianism, but with this defeat in France, it seems likely that such a move would come crashing down with the minister-president being blamed. After all, because the war was so much longer than the Brothers' War and ended in defeat, it will be seen as a complete blunder by the nobility, so there will likely be increased demands for constitutionalism, especially in places like Hanover or Saxony, which were recent Prussian conquests not yet fully integrated into the Federation, despite having their own representation. As a result, I would expect to see a second power struggle emerge between Wilhelm and the legislature, or even just an out-and-out strike and protest against the executive power of the monarchy. As a result, from the 1870s on, power would shift, possibly by force, to the Reichstag of the German Confederation. But what does this entail? Well, that's where things get kind of weird. See, the largest party in the Reichstag in our timeline was the National Liberal Party, which was fond of things like being the ugliest color of green, German unification, and suppression of Catholics. They were more or less pro-Bismarck after the 1860s, though, so the increased parliamentarian rule could effectively strengthen Bismarckian policies without actually having Otto himself involved. The Social Democratic Party wasn't founded until 1875, and the primary opposition to Bismarck came from the Centre Party, which was mostly comprised of Catholics. It seems plausible that the National Liberals split in the aftermath of the defeat, which could result in the mainstay National Liberals coalitioning with the Conservatives and the breakaways working with the other liberal parties. There were a lot of those, and possibly the Zentrum. As a result, I would expect to see franchise law liberalized while the iron is hot for reform. While Prussia had universal male suffrage, they also weighed it based on land ownership and property, which I would expect to see the more liberal liberals force the state to back off of. As a result, the country would likely enter a quasi-Weimar era politically as various factions rise and fall in attempts to exploit this expansion of the vote, as well as the anger and unexpressed nationalism arising from the failure to unify. However, without such total devastation, the country will be more economically stable. While the loss of the Rhine will hurt badly, Germany will be able to recover. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video, please consider like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. And if you're already subscribed and want to support the channel in other ways, I have channel memberships available for as little as $2.99 a month. Thank you so much for watching. Let's get back to the show. In the West, France is also going to have a weird time in the 1870s. It's reaffirmed its position as the leading power of Europe, something it hasn't seriously had since the days of the actually cool Napoleon. However, the opposition to the emperor is hardly weakened by the win. Napoleon himself is old and only has one son, and in the late 1860s he was forced to reinstate a parliament after working to dismantle it. In fact, during the 1860s, as he got older and sicker, he became less and less active in government before his death in 1873. However, he was also something of a liberal and modernist. He implemented pro-education reforms, including greatly expanding access to it for women and girls, and even helped rebuild cities like Paris into the icons of the Belle Epoque that we know them to be. Plus, he even ensured the right to strike. Insert joke about French politics here. However, this also created a lot of public debt, which would be worse here because of the money spent on military reforms and the war, and led to opposition from both the Republicans for being a monarchy and the politically active Catholics because of his failures to protect the papacy and his secular education system. In addition, the country's voting system also favored the ruralites versus the urban city dwellers, and this bled into an 1860 referendum on his reforms. So, what happens in 1873 when Napoleon III dies? Well, to start with, let's meet his son, Louis Napoleon. I'm going to call him Emperor Louis I, because even though there's been a million fucking Louis in France, I need to keep him distinct from his father. Regardless, Louis was much more of a devout Catholic than his father, and would likely pull back from the secularization of government, and lean on conservative Catholics for support. However, I also think that he will struggle to maintain imperial power, and eventually the Corps Legislatif will assume supremacy, somewhat similar to in Prussia. If anything, I actually think that the Second Empire surviving is unlikely. After all, opposition to Napoleon III was bipartisan at this point, while the Prussian king at least has some support from the conservatives. Thus, I think that Emperor Louis makes it a few years, maybe to 1876, before being deposed by a presidential republic. How powerful that presidency would be highly unpredictable, but personally, I think directly electing your executive is more democratic than not, so whatever. Regarding politics, I would imagine that this version of the Third Republic would have a more or less stable system. During the actual Third Republic, here, however, the monarchy withered on the vine, so to speak, discrediting Bonapartists on the right and leaving Orleanists and Legitimists divided. As a result, it would likely evolve into a three-party system of socialists on the left, Republicans in the middle, by which I mean liberals, and then conservatives on the right. There's no point speculating on how powerful the presidency would be, but I'm imagining it on the stronger side for a European republic. Painting back out to foreign policy, this war has very immediate consequences. Firstly, France has proven it remains the most powerful state in Europe and avoids diplomatic isolation. This means that the Entente Cordiale is not only impossible, but unnecessary, since France isn't afraid of Germany here. In contrast, Britain will be very keen to prop up Prussia as a continental counterweight to France. The only other real choice is Russia, but strengthening them comes at a risk to British India. Now, granted, most of this will be a general trend rather than anything concrete, since in 1870, most of the great powers still generally aim to solve things through compromise. France, for its part, has some other choices, at least if it plays its cards right, but we'll get there. Speaking of, the first major crisis I expect to see divergence of is the Congress of Berlin in 1879. In 1878, Russia beat up the Ottomans for the 10th time this century, and crafted a pretty brutal treaty that would have near totally destroyed Ottoman influence in the Balkans, with particular efforts to turn Bulgaria into a regional power. Incidentally, one that would have been completely indebted to Russia, and with enough territorial conflicts with its neighbors to stay loyal. However, the treaty also would have given Russia an out into the Mediterranean and destroyed pretenses of the Ottomans being a great power, which would have undermined French and British aims for Egypt. In steps Germany, who manages to secure independence for Romania and Serbia, but left Bulgaria in a reduced state and still a vassal of the Ottomans. Except, there is no Bismarck. His position collapsed with the war with France, and Prussia isn't nearly as powerful as Germany. Instead, the power in the best position to hold the conference is France. They share British concerns about Russia projecting power into the Med, but lack direct Balkan interests, and have the diplomatic and military credibility here. Of course, this assumes that the conference happens, but I think it would. France and Britain both want Russia contained at this point, and neither want the collapse of the Ottomans or Austria precisely because they contain the Tsardom. So, what does this version of the conference look like? Well, bearing in mind that this is all more or less arbitrary, here's what I came up with. Bulgaria and Romania receive full independence, the former being a bit bigger than our timeline, but Serbia is left as a vassal of the Ottomans, while the Bosnians are more or less left alone. This is much less extreme than the actual conference in my opinion, but it allows the Russians their highway into the Ottoman Empire and a friendly Bulgaria, while keeping the rest of the great powers more or less okay with the situation. It also prevents Austria from occupying Bosnia, which, might be a good thing for them. Alternatively, France might be convinced to allow Russia a bigger Bulgarian vassal in exchange for support when France invades the Low Countries. Now, why am I so confident that France would take this gamble? Well, it was a long-term goal of Napoleon III and likely would be of his son. And frankly, it was a long-term goal of France as a whole, not just of the Second Empire. Control over the Low Countries as a region would make France nearly impenetrable from the east, give it immense coal and resource deposits, and allow it a massive population lead. Its only real rival at that point would be Britain, just the way Paris likes it. And with Prussia too weak and diplomatically isolated, Russia turning the other way, and Austria either distracted or scared of France, they would invade Belgium and Luxembourg sometime in the 1870s to 1880s, with only Britain able to mount an objection. However, the fact of it is, even if Britain declares war, the Benelux would get overrun in only a couple weeks, crushed under the sheer weight of France and flanked from both the south and the east. However, now it's France's turn to have their conquests mitigated by the rest of the great powers. Don't you love peer-reviewed imperialism? Regardless, the rest of Europe can't accept France getting all of Belgium or the Netherlands so soon after conquering the Rhineland. Bad memories, you could say. As a result, I would expect it to be something like this. France gets Luxembourg, eastern Belgium, and the very southeast of the Netherlands. However, Prussia guarantees the independence of the two remaining states, as does the UK. France might even have to give up some minor colonial land to the Dutch, but honestly I have no clue where. We'll say they give up Guyana or something just because this kind of conference will see them give up something. Speaking of colonialism, Prussia will be much more expansionist overseas than Germany was during the 1860s to 1880s. After all, now they need to be if they actually want to show that they're still a great power, and more than that, they would feel the need to control resources like oil and coal, now difficult to get in Prussia. The only way to get those is to expand, and Britain will be more okay with it since now there's a really big and scary France on the continent. Now this is going to be based on a few trends, such as Europeans trying to carve into East Asia, but it's also going to be a little arbitrary since, well, colonialism was arbitrary. Germany was interested in acquiring the Philippines and most of Spanish Asia, so I could see them trying to coerce a sale out of Spain. From there, it's not so unreasonable they make moves throughout Borneo. Germany also attempted to claim Formosa, modern Taiwan, from the Qing, but it was kind of an if everyone else is doing it thing, and they kind of half-assed it. But as China weakens and the public demand grows and grows, I could see them making another attempt around the 1880s. Turning to Africa, it oddly enough looks pretty similar. In our world, there was an organized conference to divide the continent in 1888, but that is unlikely to be repeated for a few reasons. Firstly, the Berlin Conference was a reaction to Belgian King Leopold trying to claim the entire fucking Congo for himself, and he is a tad unlikely to do that so soon after half his country was conquered. Secondly, again, Bismarck was sacked. This means that while there might be a conference, it is going to be different to the point of being irrelevant, which means that now we get to arbitrarily divide Africa among European powers based on rough estimations of their interests. Fucking hell. Okay, so what do we know about Africa? Well, we know that Britain controls the Cape and Egypt, while France has Algeria and Madagascar. Portugal is in Angola and Mozambique, while the Ottomans still nominally exist in Libya and Tunisia. Germany, however, has very little, if any, meaningful presence, and Belgium is very unlikely to matter. So, here's what I've come up with. Admittedly, it's a little uninspired, but the geography at the edge of the continent does limit my options here. Britain was very eager for a north-south connection, and the only reason it didn't get it at the Berlin Conference was being outvoted since Germany didn't care about the colonies and only really participated to humor the public, and because Belgium was getting the Congo. As a result, no one else got their desired east-west corridor. Here, Germany has an empire in Asia like the rest, meaning it now meaningfully needs East Africa, as opposed to only really wanting it to fuck over London. However, with the French in Europe, London and Berlin also need to work together, and thus comes this agreement somewhat haphazardly. Germany gets the edge of the coast, and Britain gets the interior, meeting both needs. France likely gets a good chunk of the Congo, as does Portugal, but otherwise Africa looks disgustingly similar to our timeline. Throughout the 1890s to 1910s, we'll enter a period of increasing tensions as both the German states get ready for round 2 with France, and as Russia becomes increasingly powerful. In terms of alliances, we'll start with the German states. Prussia could plausibly pick up both Russia and Britain, but this would require them to strike while the iron was very, very hot, since Russia's size, perceived power, and ability to threaten India will mean any Anglo-Russian treaty is very difficult to maintain. However, Britain will, at least initially, be friendly to Germany precisely because of France's own power, meaning that Russia will be the cold shoulder. As a result, the most likely alliance is Prussia, the German states, Britain, and Austria-Hungary, Russia's main rival on the continent for Balkan influence. Unfortunately, Prussia is just kind of in a tough spot diplomatically. If it sticks with Russia, it likely loses Britain and potentially Austria, but if it leans on Britain, it will fight Russia. The triple entente of our timeline was a reaction to just how much of an upset the German win in 1870 was, as well as the Anglo-German arms race, and Russia's rise scaring the German capitalist class on the border. Without all three of these events, it would have fallen apart, and even in our timeline, that particular alliance system was on the way out. So who does France get? Well, to be honest, it's hard to say. We know they get Russia, but are they able to rope in anyone else? Well, we can rule out the Benelux since France has already invaded them, and there wouldn't be much trust between the two. Italy would make sense, but at the same time has its own territorial ambitions, and isn't really a great power. Bulgaria would also be viable, and likely has Yugoslavist plans of their own, but that presupposes some level of Balkan wars. Though, to be fair, that is also likely inevitable. The question is if Bulgaria would be able to act on those nationalist goals without stoking European war itself. However, I think the Entente could feasibly get their hands on both powers. Bulgaria likely spends most of the conflict fighting Serbia and Bosnia, each with some Austrian support, but it generally won't matter too much for the war as a whole. So, the stage is set. What happens now? Well, let's assume the war starts sometime around 1910. The French president is assassinated by a German nationalist in a visit to Aachen, and over the next month, country after country mobilizes. The Franco-Prussian border along the Rhine is too heavily fortified for the French to advance into the northeast quickly, and they're forced to invade through Baden. The Prussians make early advances into Russian Poland, and Austria begins to bear down on northern Italy. The British Royal Navy is mobilized, working in tandem with the Prussian High Seas Fleet to blockade France, putting them on a timer. The sheer length of the Rhine River prevents fast mobile warfare, and the grand armies of both coalitions are forced to dig in. As the war drags on with minimal gains on either side, sometime around 1912, the French launch a risky gamble, an invasion of both Belgium and the Netherlands, unable to get around the river and the German fortifications. In addition, if the gamble pays off, then the British trade with Germany will be severely hampered due to the lack of friendly ports. However, this also brings in a longer front for the French, and greatly reduces the sympathy neutral nations might have for the country after the assassination. Pivoting to the east of the Pacific, things are weird over here. Firstly, Japan actually has to put in some effort into the fight, since they're being roped into a second Russo-Japanese war. They're likely able to occupy the far eastern territory of Russia without too much trouble, all things considered, which will further destabilize the Tsardom. However, from there, everything gets real messy, because now, French Indochina is completely surrounded between the German Philippines, Dutch East Indies, British Burma, and whatever Japan can send down there. The result is that the colony is effectively under siege, and there will likely be attempted invasions, but at the same time, I don't know how successful they would be. Such a gamble would be, without question, the biggest and most complicated such campaign in history to this point, and, naval invasions in World War I don't have the best track record. By 1913, Russia would have collapsed. The empire is besieged from all fronts, and the emperor is just as incompetent as ever. If anything, it's Japan that does him in, since Russia has already lost this war before. The result is that while there likely isn't a Russian civil war, I don't think the Tsardom survives. In all likelihood, I'd put it to a militaristic republic like Weimar Germany. Germany would create its client states in Poland and the United Baltic Duchy, while Finland would take on a French or German king. From here, the Austrians, Germans, and Brits would converge on the French lines, putting too much pressure around the metropole, and France itself would have to open negotiations like Germany in 1917. France would ultimately have to give up land to Belgium, Germany, and the Netherlands, but its continental losses would be minimal. It is also for sure losing Indochina, but I honestly have no clue how or to who. Germany would likely get the lion's share, but at the same time, it's not like Japan was a non-factor in the fighting. In contrast, Bulgaria is likely the only Entente member to win the war. It's the biggest and most industrialized Balkan nation, and frankly, its fighting with the Central Alliance is probably pretty minimal, all things considered, and now they're able to create their own Yugoslavia. With the end of the war, everything becomes very vague. Realistically, the French Republic will collapse under the weight of the war, but I'm not sure how. For some reason, I'm really partial to some form of technocratic revanchism taking root in the country, but I don't know how much sense that makes. Austria may or may not survive as a great power. A lot of their own problems came in as a result of feuds with the Russians or Ottomans that were stymied here, but it's hardly a sure thing. And of course, with Russia being forced out of the war but skipping the bloody civil war, their fate is entirely uncertain. Perhaps Japan even remains a democratic empire, even as it wages a bloody war in China, and comes into conflict with Germany due to Taiwan and the Philippines. As a result, I do think I need to end the scenario here. With the end of the Great War, the world stands beaten and battered but not broken. The French Republic is facing inward, hungering for revenge, while Russia forces itself into the 20th century. Japan's dreams of conquest in Asia are coming to fruition, and the Germans sit undeterred, while the British Empire must watch as Europe tries to find out who it is in the aftermath of such a devastating conflict. Before we go, I want to give a thank you to Tim Fredibold, Marcellus Doretta, Lisenberg Patriot, Dubs Main, and Grim Walt for being channel members, and an extra appreciation to Lisenberg Patriot, Dubs Main, and Grim Walt for joining at the exclamation point level. Thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful day, and tune in next week to explore another alternate world.